Hey there, and welcome to Evidence That Patriarchy is a Real Thing. In today's episode, I want to talk about a practice that's going on in the United States right now by evangelical Christians. They refer to it as Christian patriarchy or biblical patriarchy. So for those people who want to assert that patriarchy isn't a real thing or patriarchy doesn't exist, this is going to be a really exciting episode for you to try to counter. There is a lot of evidence that Christian patriarchy is going on right now. Right now, kids are being indoctrinated into it. Adults are enacting its values. And so to deny that it exists kind of defies logic to me. So let's look more specifically at the concept of biblical patriarchy. And in this episode, I want to look at the norms and values that it gives to men in particular. On the screen now, you're just going to see some evidence of how patriarchy is being documented and covered in the media. We have here a book that was written inside the Christian patriarchy movement. Its title is Quiverful. Then there are articles that talk about the dangerous Christian patriarchy movement promoted by the Duggar family, and also the idea that Christian reconstruction and biblical patriarchy are being actively advocated for in the evangelical movement. Clearly, these people think patriarchy is a real thing and they're doing it. So let's look a little bit more at what they are doing. In terms of defining the terms, I want to draw on a socially constructed notion of gender, and I'm going to be looking at this little excerpt. Connell argued that gender has been constructed as part of each society throughout history. For each society, Connell contended that one version of masculinity is sanctioned as the one to which men should adhere, which he termed hegemonic masculinity. This version of masculinity attempts to subordinate femininity as well as less accepted versions of masculinity, such as male homosexuality. Like Pleck, Connell recognizes many disadvantages to this narrow, dominant form of masculinity. And you can see that Connell was writing in the sort of late 80s and early 90s. I think today, increasingly, as a consequence of feminism, there are more ways to be a woman and to be feminine, and there are more ways to be a man and to be seen as masculine. And so while I agree that there's usually a hegemonic masculine discourse in a culture, I think that in the US and other places where second and third wave feminism have really taken root, men have access to far more identities that can be called masculine to challenge a sort of hegemonic masculinity that's available in the culture. And I think that that's a good and positive thing. Obviously, it goes against patriarchy, which is probably why I think it's a good and positive thing. In the real world, we would define masculinity in the following ways. Masculinity is behaviors and mannerisms which are typically associated with the male sex. There's nothing normative there. It's just saying if men tend to do it and women don't, that is often something people will characterize as masculinity. But that is not what the biblical notion of masculinity involves. Biblical patriarchy, also known as Christian patriarchy, is a set of beliefs in evangelical Christianity concerning gender relations and their manifestations in institutions, including marriage, the family, and the home. It sees the father as the head of the home, responsible for the conduct of his family. And I'm also going to draw on the concept of toxic masculinity to contrast patriarchal masculinity with modern, secular, egalitarian notions of masculinity. Toxic masculinity refers to the socially constructed attitudes that describe the masculine gender role as violent, unemotional, sexually aggressive, and so forth. When we look at the patriarchy movement, it actually is very much about constructing roles for men that are top-down, where the man has to be the dictator and has to enforce his will on others who are viewed as his subordinates. He has to be the disciplinarian and be the tough one and to not be soft. And of course, we can talk about the whole crazy website biblical gender roles and the idea that men should have sex with their wives when their wives don't want to. In fact, men should have sex with their wives when the men don't want to. Because if you don't have sex, then your wife is going to stray or you're going to stray. So it's just this thing you have to do. You have to have sex. One of the things that I see patriarchy doing in order to justify its power structure is to assign the notion of masculinity to God and then somehow try to transfer God's power and authority through characterizing it as masculine over to men, as if some of that divine masculinity rubs off on them by virtues of having a penis. And so I think that it's a very artificial construction that does not have a basis in reality. But I think that that is how they try to justify giving power to men and excluding women. And it's this idea that God is somehow masculine, even though they also said that he is genderless. So again, contradictions, but we don't really expect faith-based views to make sense, right? In this world where God's masculinity is representative of his divine authority and power, and that's rubbing off on men, the worldview is that God has granted men authority over their families, and preferably men should be in charge of the workplace as well. Men should rule in the private and the public spheres, not because of their competence, not because they've earned it, not because they are the most qualified, but because they are men. That's it. They're men, therefore they rule. It's that simple. Single women are encouraged not to try to seek jobs as equals among men in fields that invoke authority, such as industry, commerce, civil government, and the military. So it's telling women that their roles are to remove themselves from competition with men, because those roles of authority only properly can go to men by virtue of God's masculinity by implication. Unmarried grown children are also considered under the rules of their fathers, but while a son can go find a vocation and find a wife, he should seek his father's advice. Women, on the other hand, should stay at home, and also they should allow their father to have a veto say in finding a husband, and they should allow their fathers to guide them in finding a husband. So we can kind of contrast and compare the man's autonomy, a son's autonomy, compared with the daughter's submissiveness, even as adults, even on the issue of marriage. And again, because we're focusing on men's roles, there's also the idea that fathers are ultimately responsible for the education that their kids get, which is why in the homeschooling tradition, this patriarchy thing is very important. Men are expected to make sure that their wives are teaching their kids what they're meant to be doing. Because again, women don't have authority independently. If they have authority, they get it from the man in order to exercise it. To restate my previous point as a way to segue to the next, I see biblical patriarchy as being an attempt to justify the submission and domination of women to whatever men decide without question. It attempts to do this by associating masculinity not with the male body, but associating masculinity with the divine power and authority of their God. And then they link this divine masculinity to mundane masculinity in order to prevent a rational critique of the power relations, or to even undermine the power relations and try to transfer them to a different set of values, basis of which you can decide who's going to make decisions in a relationship. Biblical patriarchy assigns specific powers to men, but then it also dictates very specific and narrow roles in which those powers can be used. Biblical patriarchy traps men in forms of toxic masculinity where they're expected to be not emotional as opposed to nurturing and caring fathers. How do you be a stay-at-home dad and only be a disciplinarian? It puts a lot of weight on men to provide the financial basis, saying that women shouldn't go out to work, women should stay in the home. In modern times, having one person earn the income for the family is just not reasonable. We're really kind of on a system where two incomes are needed to maintain a middle-class standing. So again, putting all this pressure on men and not letting women have their equality then burdens them unreasonably. If they just had more egalitarian views, then women's economic contributions could really help the family out. So there's a lot of problems with the kinds of values associated with being a proper man that comes with Christian patriarchy. And we can see from the evidence that there are children right now in the United States who are being homeschooled into this crazy bullshit and being taught that girls should be submissive and serve men and men should rule over women by virtue of what sex you end up with. This is craziness, and we're not going to really address it and take it on until we admit that it exists and point out the problems that are inherent in a structure that's based on domination, power, and submission. That's not good for human flourishing. In biblical patriarchy, men are assigned all the power, all the power. There might be a little bit where women also have some authority to discipline and rule over their own kids, but that's debatable. So in a patriarchy system, in the biblical patriarchy system that we're talking about, if you have a power, it all just goes to the men, right? They're empowered by their God and with divine authority to run their church and decide how men get to wield power, not only inside the church, but inside the home, not only inside the home, but also in the public sphere, in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, and in the social sphere. In this dichotomy of power relations, Men are given the power, but then asked to be kind and loving. But there's no punishment or loss of power if they're not loving and kind. Whereas women are expected to submit, and it's pretty easy to identify disobedience. So women in this situation it's quite easy for men to point out where women are going wrong and discipline them, where it's much harder for women to critique the lovingness of a man's actions, because you can always say, well, I'm trying to be cruel to be kind, and this is how God would do it. So there's again a real disparate amount of power and expectation and also responsibility that goes with the power that is assigned by biblical patriarchy. And as I said, it puts that burden on men to financially control the finances of the home as well as provide for all the people inside of it. Now, obviously, it's better to have power than not have power. So, it's in a patriarchal system, it's better to be born a man than a woman, because at least you have some autonomy, you have some agency in terms of how your life goes. But that agency is, again, only allowed to operate within a very narrow parameter. It has to be heteronormative. There's no place in this biblical patriarchy for the dignity of gay men. And it associates masculinity with domination, with possession, and with forcing conformity onto others as the way to be a proper man. It views men who can't control members of their family as deficient. And this, of course, creates an incentive, a social incentive for men to act as dictators or authoritarians, punish or force people in their family to behave in certain ways because it looks bad for him in the eyes of the other men. This, again, is a really perverted system of this honor culture, where somehow this is what ends up leading to things like honor killings, putting one person's honor on the line for other people's behavior and then giving them power to control those people's lives is basically a situation, when it comes to teenagers, that's just asking for potential problems. And as I said, it requires men to be the only economic provider and punisher in the home. Biblical patriarchy directly harms men by normalizing authoritarian power structures instead of promoting egalitarian ones. It renders invisible and unspeakable male victims of sexual assault or male victims of abuse. And we can see how this manifests in modern United States culture by this pervasive silence on the issue of prison rape or about men being raped in general. We see a lack of funding for support services for male victims of abuse or sexual assault. And all of that, in part, I think, can be traced back to an unwillingness of other men who have patriarchal values to see the dignity of those male victims, or even to acknowledge that that is a possibility. And so that is where the problem of patriarchy comes in terms of victimizing men within its own system. It is explicitly homophobic. There is no place for dignity for gay men within their male peers in a biblical patriarchy structure. They're just denied that their sexuality is valid, and therefore their human nature is also not recognized by their peers. It's a framework that judges men, fathers in particular, on how well their family members obey and conform, not whether he is a nurturing parent. And we can again see this by this lack of sort of respect that's given to stay-at-home dads, structures that support stay-at-home dads. Even in public places, having access to a baby changing unit that's not in a women's toilet means, a women's restroom for Americans who need softer language. But that's a problem for dads who take their kids out. If the baby needs to be changed and the only changing facility is in the women's toilets, then how are you supposed to feel like you're an equal member, your fatherhood is being valued and respected when your needs are not being seen? And I think, again, this is a manifestation of the kinds of roles that patriarchy confines men to, as opposed to empowering them to take on whatever roles as men they want to take on. And again, I have the point about the honor killings and the honor system anyway, and judging men for humiliating men for the behavior of their family members, which of course is then just going to knock down into a punishment, humiliation for the child or the wife or whoever is trying to exert some autonomy. So problematic. If you want to see just vile patriarchal views being expressed on a regular basis, go to this website, Biblical Gender Roles. It's terrible. The guy who's writing this is a caveman, in my opinion. Just no real thought about the psychological or emotional implications of his own advice, because it's more focused on obedience than on compassion. This is from that website, Biblical Gender Roles, Why Did God Make Man? God has placed us in temporary bodies and given us temporary roles to fulfill this life. In many ways, it is like a test. If you were born in a man's body, you have a man's test to take. If you were born in a woman's body, you have a woman's test to take. Leadership. God designated men to lead in society, the church, and the home. Protection. God designed men to protect in society and the family. Provision. God designed men to provide for their society, church, and family. Conclusion. God made man in his image and likeness to bring glory and honor to himself. To demonstrate some of his eternal qualities, he has designated and delegated man to lead, provide, and protect in society, the church, and most importantly, the family. Patriarchy, real thing. This is also from a website called Biblical Men and What is Masculinity. Masculinity is not simply maleness. Just because you have male parts doesn't make you masculine. God is the ultimate example of true masculinity, yet the Bible tells us he has no physical body. So the idea of masculinity is not just tied to anatomy. True masculinity is the humble, glad assumption of God-given responsibilities. God ordains and describes the roles and the job requirements attached to them. Men humbly and gladly accept these roles and requirements and walk in them by his grace. Masculinity and authority flow to those who accept responsibility and flee from those who shirk responsibility. In conclusion, I think you can see that even though we might want to call Christian patriarchy within the religious sphere, the norms of Christian patriarchy extend beyond the religious sphere. It definitely crosses the private sphere, dominates the private sphere, and it tries to control the public sphere. It wants to say that women shouldn't be in politics. It wants to say that women shouldn't hold economic authority over men. It wants to say that women shouldn't have higher social status than men. So all of these are reasons why, if you are asking on one of my videos, why is it if women got the right to vote in 1920, they didn't really start running for office until the 1970s? Well, part of the reason is because of the norms and also the legal barriers because of religious patriarchy. While it is easier to point out all of the problematic things that patriarchy creates for women, it is, I think, important to analyze the way that power is structured and justified and handed over, and also on the conditions placed on it. That happens within religious patriarchy, because while on the face of it, as I said, yes, it's much better within the system to be a man, because at least by being a man you have power and some kind of agency and autonomy. That in and of itself is still limited by the very narrow roles and the sort of toxic ways that you are expected to be a man, very limiting ways, shall we say, and encouraging a kind of toxic mentality when it comes to controlling the members of your family. And also, making sure you're having sex with your wife even if she doesn't want to, even if you don't want to, because God wants you to have sex. The crazy biblical gender roles website. The guy is nutters, in my opinion. But, so what I thought would be interesting again was to take this issue of patriarchy and focus on the way that it distorts maleness and masculinity for men, because that is maybe something that people who are doubtful will have a more of an intuitive link to and find more substance to debate here. So hopefully by watching this video, you're reconsidering your views if you doubted that patriarchy was a real thing, or that patriarchy was a problem, or that patriarchy somehow doesn't exist in the 21st century. It does. People are out there right now promoting it, practicing it, teaching it to their children. And if you deny its existence, then you can't really fight against it. So I hope that you guys have enjoyed another of these episodes of evidence that patriarchy is a real thing. I would assume that the next video will talk about women in patriarchy, but if something for whatever reason comes up, I don't want to fix my plans, say that I'm going to do something in case something comes up. But if I do it, it probably will be on women and patriarchy. So I guess that all that remains to be said is that thanks for watching to the end of the video. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed this content, please go ahead and subscribe. I'm really close to 1,500 subscribers, which is crazy. Just that it took me like a year to get to 1,000. It's taken me like 2 months to get to 1,500. I'm like, whee! This is so much fun. Please sub if you enjoy this content and you are a sub. Share it with someone you like that you think might enjoy it as well. And then the last thing to say is that I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. And I'll see you soon. Bye.